Hey folks, in case you haven't already heard, quite a few Legion raid bosses are going to be tuned down for patch 9.1.5. Since a lot of people were curious about how easy it would be to solo the older bosses, I decided I was going to fully clear through each Legion raid on the PTR to see for myself. First, let's go over exactly what 9.1.5 is changing. In Trial of Valor, Helya was nerfed, but I have no idea what was changed, and neither does anybody that I talk to. The fight is already a joke to solo on retail, and it remains that way in the PTR. In the Nighthold, Gul'dan's mythic phase was nerfed so that the demonic parasites no longer stun you. This removes the tight damage check in the final phase, meaning that a lot more people should be able to solo it. In Tomb of Sargeras, 3 bosses were nerfed: the Desolate Host, Fallen Avatar, and Kil'jaeden. Desolate Host no longer casts an AoE pulse if one of the phases is empty, Avatar has a longer charge up time during phase 1, and Kil'jaeden deals slightly less damage along with having a moderate reduction to his orb knockbacks. I'll discuss these bosses in more detail later. In Antorus the Burning Throne, 5 bosses were nerfed: Antoran High Command, Eonar, Varimathras, Coven of Shivarra, and Aggramar. Once again, I have no idea what was changed for Antoran High Command despite testing it on both PTR and retail. Eonar, however, now casts her Life Force ability much faster, which reduces the amount of adds that you need to kill in order to complete the fight. Varimathras will now not cast his Alone in the Dark ability at all if you're soloing him, making the fight a complete joke. The 99% damage reduction for Coven of Shivarra has been removed, so you can now just stack the bosses and burn them down, once again making the fight a complete joke. Aggramar's Flame Run knockback has been reduced down to basically LFR levels, so at this point the fight is only a moderate damage and healing check. Now that I've reviewed the changes, we can talk about how easy soloing each raid actually is in 9.1.5. That said, I won't be going through every single boss fight and every single mechanic because we'd be here for hours and most of them really aren't that important. For starters, I'm going to show on screen a list of every single boss that can be burned through with solid damage. Some of these bosses may have problematic mechanics, and if you take a really long time to kill them, you might struggle, but anybody with reasonable gear should be able to just tunnel them and ignore everything. Emerald Nightmare, which is completely unchanged by the patch, has only one notable fight, and that's Ilgy'noth. This fight isn't really hard, but you do need to make sure that you kite the Bloods under the big eye so that their on-death explosion deals damage properly, but once you get to Ilgy'noth's heart, the fight just turns into an easy damage check like pretty much every other boss in the raid. Trial of Valor is interesting because I actually felt that Odin could have used the change instead of Helya. I mean, it's not to say the fight is hard, right? It's just frustrating because the adds will get a 99% damage reduction if they're too close together. So this is easily bypassed if you kite one add away while the other is casting, because that gives you a few seconds to DPS freely. Now, once again, this fight's not hard, but Blizzard already removed the damage reduction aura on Coven of Shivarra, so it feels weird that it's still in place on Odin. Now, Gwarm is just an extremely easy damage check boss, and Helya, despite evidently being nerfed, is still a complete pushover, just like she is on retail. The only notable part about her fight is the intermission where you have to kill her tentacles in order to damage her, but that's really not hard. I tested this a few times on retail, I might be missing something, but the fight appears to be completely unchanged. Now, as previously mentioned, the only boss in Nighthold that got nerfed was Gul'dan, and that's only for his mythic phase. Every single fight leading up to Gul'dan is a complete joke and can be easily burned through. Gul'dan himself can be a bit tricky, but overall he's not too hard. When you pull him on Mythic, make sure you're not too close to the wall or you're going to get knocked off immediately. When he transitions into his second phase, he'll start to drag players off the platform. Save any mobility spells you have for that part of the fight. With the removal of the stun from parasites in the final phase, the rest of the fight basically turns into a standard DPS check, which most players at this point shouldn't really struggle with. Next up is Tomb of Sargeras, and this is where things start to get a little bit tricky. To start off, I'll reiterate that Goroth, Harshatan, Sisters of the Moon, and Desolate Host are all really easy burn bosses. Desolate Host used to have a tight healing check due to his pulsing AoE, but the removal of that mechanic has effectively trivialized the fight. The first boss that will actually force you to do mechanics is Demonic Inquisition. After you get hit by a few of their attacks, the bar on your screen will begin to glow red and you'll gain an extra action button. Using this button will send you into the cage with a big ad that you'll need to beat up. You don't need to actually kill the ad, you just need to damage it enough until these little yellow balls spawn, and then you need to collect the balls to empty your bar. From here, you can just click the button again to continue the fight as normal. It's not very hard, but you do need to pay attention to this and purge your bar or all of your attacks will begin to miss. Mistress Sassz'ine is next, and she's not too difficult, but you do need to be mindful of her mechanics. This fight is primarily just a single target DPS check, but there's a few important things that you need to avoid. Now, for starters, you'll want to keep the boss towards the center because the edges can be very dangerous. Pufferfish will periodically spawn in a pattern around the sides of the room, and it's essential that you do not touch these. After the boss hits a certain health threshold, these pufferfish will spawn big red circles below them which cause a shark to leap up and one-shot anybody stood within it. Eels will sometimes spawn during the fight, and if you kill them, it causes a green puddle to drop onto the ground. You should move out of this green puddle because otherwise your attacks will begin to miss. Now, every now and then, a massive white box will appear in the center of the room, and it's pretty important that you run to the side of the room in order to avoid this. While the damage is technically survivable if you have enough health, it's really easy to dodge it, so you might as well do it. Finally, a whale will sometimes latch itself onto the wall and begin to pull you in. Around the whale, you'll see two concentric circles. To stop this mechanic, step into one of the purple puddles around the room and run into the outermost circle. This will feed the puddle to the whale, and after some time, the mechanic will stop. If you run into the innermost circle, you will take lethal damage, so don't do that. This may seem like a lot to take in, but it really boils down to avoid the bad stuff and tunnel the boss. Maiden of Vigilance is a fairly easy damage race boss, provided you don't mess up your bomb. At the start of the fight, you'll be debuffed with either Holy or Fel, and touching a mechanic of the opposite color will place a bomb on you. When you solo Maiden, getting a bomb is unavoidable. Fortunately, this is an extremely easy mechanic to deal with. Just put your back to the wall, and you'll get shot into the air, and you'll slide back down. This results in a small amount of fall damage, but it's nowhere near enough to kill you. The only other mechanic of note is her teleport, which she'll cast after 45 seconds. This will briefly stun you, after which you'll need to run over to her, break her shield, and interrupt her Wrath of the Creators cast. From here, the fight just repeats until you kill her. Fallen Avatar was one of the bosses that got nerfed in 9.1.5, and despite that, he's actually still quite challenging. There might be a few damage tweaks or mechanical changes that I haven't fully noticed, but the primary difference is that the boss gains energy at a vastly reduced rate during Phase 1. This means that you have way more time to burn him down, resulting in a much easier DPS check than the one we have on retail. However, it's not as simple as just tunneling the boss, because you still need to understand the mechanics in order to actually maximize your damage here. The reason that Avatar gains energy in Phase 1 is because of the beams around the room which channel into him. Each set of beams will contain one green beam and two purple beams. Green beams can be soaked by dragging the Maiden of Valor between the beam and the boss. Purple beams can only be soaked by players, but if you let yourself get 10 stacks of the debuff, you will instantly die. For this reason, I recommend ignoring the purple beams entirely and just focusing on getting the Maiden to soak the green beam. It's also important that during this phase you cleave evenly between the boss and the Maiden. If the boss hits 100% energy, he will instantly kill the Maiden, transition to Phase 2, and absorb whatever health she has remaining. Ideally, you want to kill the Maiden shortly before the boss hits 100% energy, as that will give you the maximum amount of time needed to DPS him down. Phase 2 of Avatar remains completely unchanged. You're going to want to kite him to one of the corners, soak the green circles if it happens to spawn on your platform, and then it's just a race to the finish. Because of the green circle mechanic, pretty much every single platform except 2 will get destroyed over the course of the fight, so you have until the end of his second Ruptured Realities cast to actually kill him. Overall, while the nerf does make the boss easier, it actually does so in a way that requires you to understand the fight, and I really like this. The boss still feels a bit challenging, but it's going to be killable by a much larger amount of the player base. Kil'jaeden is another boss that got nerfed in 9.1.5, and while this has made him a bit easier, he is no pushover. I won't bother going into all of his mechanics, as most of them can be easily healed through, but the true challenge to Kil'jaeden is his bouncy purple balls. When these land, it's important that you position yourself so that the knockback carries you towards the next ball in the pattern. The knockback on these has been slightly reduced, and it feels a bit closer to the strength of the knockback on heroic difficulty. This mechanic can't be ignored unless you're a demon hunter, so it's crucial that you understand how to actually do it. That said, the real challenge of the fight will eventually come from the darkness phase, also known as the Ilgy'noth phase. While the darkness is active, you can't actually see anything unless it's really close to you, which means that you'll have no idea where the balls are spawning. Also, while the balls are actually spawning, you're expected to find Ilgy'noth in the darkness and then hunt down adds which jump randomly around the room. If you have some ability to negate knockbacks, this part of the fight is actually fairly easy. For instance, as a warrior, I simply cast Charge or Heroic Leap the moment the orb explosion went off, and then I was immediately back on. But for classes without any form of anti-knockback, this phase is actually so brutal that I'd go as far as to say you really shouldn't solo it. Your best chance is to pick a corner, run to it, and pray that you won the 1 out of 4 chance. Now, it is worth noting that swapping to Night Fae will give you a way to negate at least one of the knockbacks, so that might be something to consider, but I still don't think it's that consistent. And if you somehow manage to survive this phase, you can simply burn KJ and just finish the rest of the fight. Finally, it's time to talk about Antorus. As previously mentioned, the first few bosses, including Garathi Worldbreaker, Hounds of Sargeras, Antoran High Command, and Portal Keeper Hazabel, can be very easily burned down. Eonar, however, is still a challenging boss despite the nerfs. While it should be 100% doable for every class and spec, you're going to need to follow a basic strategy. First, start the fight and run to the entrance. Here, you're going to kill off demons until you've finished off the big robot. Try to AoE down as many adds as you can as you run to the walkway, and then use your extra action button to leap into the highest platform in the room. At this time, there's going to be another robot and a Fel Lord spawning on that top platform. Kill them both and then jump down to Eonar. If you didn't finish off all the ads from the entrance, they should be attacking her here. Kill them off and then hop down to the lower path, but you're gonna need to kill just enough demons to trigger Eonar's life force. Around this time, the Praxis is gonna spawn. Use your extra action button to leap into one of the flowers, which will teleport you onto the ship. Burn the ad inside as quickly as possible and then run around to grab all 4 crystals. It's imperative that you grab the crystals on the far side of the ship first, because you won't have enough time to escape the Praxis otherwise. When you exit, run over to the far side of Eonar's room to kill the robot on the bottommost platform. At this point, the fight is fairly straightforward. Just kill various demons until you trigger the 3rd life force. For the last life force, you have 2 options. Either farm enough demons until the 4th one activates, or hop onto the Praxis and kill the mini-boss to immediately activate it. The latter is easier, but it does result in the ship exploding while you're still inside of it, which is a little bit problematic. That said, either way, you will get credit for the kill, so it's not a big deal. Next, there's Imonar and Kil'jaeden. Both of these bosses are fairly straightforward and just boil down to damage checks, but each has a few mechanics which you might need to keep in mind. For Imonar, he'll periodically force you to cross a bridge with a lot of traps on it, and you could take the safe approach like I do in this recording, but it takes a bit of time and practice to truly master. Alternatively, you can just pop a defensive and bulldoze through all the traps, and I mean, they're not lethal, but they do pack a bit of a punch. As long as you have some self-healing, honestly, this strategy is probably easier. The only traps you really need to avoid at all costs are these green circles because they will stun you, and that's obviously not good. For Kil'jaeden, the only mechanic of note is the fact that he spawns robots. You could probably ignore them and just burn him, but he's immune while the robots are activating, so you might as well kill them. It just lowers your damage intake. But otherwise, yeah, fight's just a simple damage burn. Varimathras used to be a fairly difficult boss with a pretty tight damage check, but now he's literally the easiest boss in the entire raid. The 9.1.5 changes just removed his Alone in the Darkness ability entirely if you're soloing it, so killing him is just a breeze. Similarly, Coven of Shivarra lost their 99% damage reduction if they're close together, so you can just kind of cleave them down and finish the fight extremely quickly. Aggramar is pretty much a joke now as well, because his only truly challenging mechanic was Flame Rend, but that's been nerfed into oblivion. I can kind of see Aggramar being a survivability check for people with really low gear, but personally, I had 0 issues killing him, so I think if you're struggling, just get more gear. It's also worth noting that Flame Rend can still knock you off, but that's only if you're right on the edge, so just keep Aggramar centered and you're going to be fine. Now, on to Argus. He has received absolutely no changes in 9.1.5, but some people still consider him to be a fairly difficult encounter. That said, his challenge boils down entirely to gear once again. If you find yourself struggling with Argus, you could theoretically min-max the fight and reduce your damage taken, but realistically your time would just be better spent farming gear in Korthia or Sanctum of Domination. And that covers every single Legacy raid boss in Legion. Overall, I think the changes were really good, and every single boss except for maybe Fallen Avatar and Kil'jaeden should be pretty easily soloable for every player. While I do think that Fallen Avatar and KJ are a fun challenge, I think they could probably use an additional nerf. If I had to personally suggest one for Avatar, it would be to stop the green circles in P2 from destroying platforms. This would allow you to get up to 4 total Ruptured Realities casts, if you played correctly, and I think that would overall make the fight a lot more approachable for people that don't have a ton of gear. For Kil'jaeden, the only remaining issue I have is the difficulty of the Dark Phase for people without anti-knockback abilities. An easy solution to this would be to remove the Fog of War effect, and I know that not everybody would enjoy this, but I think it would still preserve most of the challenge, but it would remove the element of randomness where you have to guess which side the orb is coming from. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to toss it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I will catch you in the next one.